What's up, y'all? It's your boy Chris Miller G, and man, it's been a little minute. I'm sorry, y'all. Life be lifing, but I am dedicated. There's gonna at least always be an episode every month, and depending how long the episode is, we'll break it up into parts. All right. So with that being said, what's going on, y'all? This is meeting CHH, where we keep it real, we keep explaining, we keep appreciating, and we keep leading. Let's do it, man. I don't know if y'all noticed, but in my interview when I was asking everybody what artists had put them on in CHH. It was an artist that, or a group rather, that kept coming up, and that was the Cross Movement. One of my Pastor Chip, said was, "Hey, during that time before then, you had like T Bone and Gospel Gangsters, and you didn't really have nobody else. Christian rap wasn't existing or wasn't around like that. Nobody was really out there. So it made me question, like, yo, who was out there at this time? Like, how did cross movement get here? How did we get here within CHH? What's the history? When I was looking into it, I went to a deep dive, and I was, whew, boy, I was in there diving deep in the web, trying to figure out how did we get here. And for this episode, we're gonna be going through the history or the decades of CHH. So we're gonna go from the 80s, where it started, to the 90s, where things started, being pioneered. Then we're gonna go from the 2000s to the 2010s, where things started building, especially the infrastructure, and then to where we're at now in the 2020s, and where CHH may go in the future. To understand Christian hip hop, you gotta understand how it was born. While hip hop was still young, we're talking about, remember, hip hop with DJ Kool Herc and them. You had the DJs and you had MCs MCing at that time. While it was still forming, we're talking about what, mid late 70s, going into the early 80s. You had, some artists like Sugar Hill Gang. I think DMCs started popping up around that time as well. While hip hop was still young and in that phase, Christian hip hop was already born. So hip hop was still young, and the church did not know what to do with it. Rap music was often associated with what? And so I could only imagine then, we're talking about while hip hop is still fresh out the womb, and now you got these Christians, the church trying to figure out what to do with it. I could only imagine how it was demonized and people just overlooked it. There was no Christian hip hop labels. There was no playlists. There was no conferences. There was none of these concerts, and you had no system designed to support this new thing. So Christian hip hop, it didn't start with opportunity like that, like we have it today. So when people say Christian rap didn't exist back then, what they really mean is that the infrastructure as we know it today, that didn't exist. However, there were definitely Christian rappers at that time. And matter of fact, one of our first ones, he's credited usually because he didn't just perform, but he pressed records. He reached radio and he entered the public circulation with his music. He was an actual artist. All right. So he wasn't just doing this for fun. He was actually doing this. Most people point to Stephen Wiley as the first Christian rapper. What makes Wiley significant is not that he was just rapping about Jesus. He was already a musician. He was a jazz drummer. He was a DJ and someone already moving in those music circles while hip hop was still forming. He was in there. He was already in the rooms with the likes of like Sugar Hill Gang. Like not only seeing them perform, but backstage chopping it up with them and even showcasing like, what he had, the talents that he had. Y'all heard the song, "We're playing basketball. Yeah, we're playing basketball." So we widely attribute that to Curtis Blow, right? Even though Lil Bow Wow remixed it, and it's probably in our heads with Lil Bow Wow, but we know he got it from Curtis Blow. Stephen Wiley claims that, he's actually the one who wrote that song. The song that we know from Lil Bow Wow, Curtis Blow, originally actually came from Stephen Wiley, which is crazy. Had passed it off to Sylvia Robinson, one of the founders of Sugar Hill Records, who was involved with Sugar Hill Gang, and like he was in that. Like he had ties already, trying to make moves, business moves. with the producer of Sugar Hill Gang, and which is crazy. Like he was already dabbling in the industry there, and apparently he got ripped off. Supposedly, this has been happening even then, which is crazy. Right before he was going to secure, I think, a deal too, before he started doing Christian hip hop. But Stephen Wiley, apparently, he had a moment, coming to Jesus moment, where he decided, man, he was going to start using these gifts. I think it was while he was on a bus. He decided to not to show up to the rec label, to whatever meeting he had for the offer, and decided he was going to pursue Jesus. So, man, shout out to Stephen Wiley for band and do this Christian hip hop, which it wasn't even called Christian hip hop at the time. It was just hip hop, but with a different message. And it's important to note that because, man, Christian hip hop actually, it didn't start as imitation, as some people may believe. Like, okay, let me just copy what they're doing. Nah, it actually started as participation. Like, you had someone already being cut from the same cloth as Sugar Hill Gang and them in the business, within the hip hop scene. He wasn't just imitating something and doing it within the church. He actually came from that. So Christian hip hop didn't start as imitation. It started as participation. And it just had a different message. Come on, y'all. Don't play with it. In 1982, Wiley released a song called Bible Break. Now, look, when you listen to this, you got to remember how hip hop sounded at that time. Believe it or not, Christian hip hop sounded just as good or just on par with hip hop at that time. The way hip hop sounded then, that's how they sounded. And it popped off. Like, the churches, they was eating it up. Yeah, in 1986, Bible Break became the first rap song to hit #1 on Christian radio. We're talking about in the 80s. So that was already historic. Here's what most people don't know. Man, at that time with hip hop, the way things were charted was a lot different than today. Because today, with barcodes and everything that's scanned, and now with everything that's streamed, we could kind of automatically get those numbers, even though some of it is superficial or botted. But back then, things were more manual. Things were distributed through like places where you buy music, and we're talking about cassettes. We didn't even have CDs like that then. So by that time, before 1991, Billboard, what they had to do, they would have to hit up these stores and talk to the managers or whatnot and be like, hey, how much was sold? La 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 la, this and this and that. And for Christian music, it was usually through like Christian bookstores, almost exclusively through the Christian Bookseller Association. So what's the problem? Well, many bookstore managers, they refused to put anything up related to rap. There was pushback there because, people weren't used to, first of all, black people expressing themselves the way that they were, and in that culture. America wasn't too fond of what, these rappers had to say and how they look. So the pushback was real. And unfortunately, within the Christian circles, it was the same. And they got a lot of pushback. A lot of that success will not come because the system was just not there for it. The system had already favored the more established pop and worship music artists. And whatever genres that the store owners really didn't, respect like that, just got ignored. Which, in this case, let alone hip hop, try Christian hip hop. So, tough break, Stephen. So artists like Stephen Wiley, who sold thousands of cassettes at churches, at youth groups, and out of trunks, none of those sales ever counted for him. Even though Stephen Wiley had like this success within the radio, that never translated to any Billboard charts. Not because people wasn't necessarily like buying his song, the Bible Break project, but because of where and how it was sold. This doesn't mean this was failure necessarily. It was just a mismatch of what the system actually was pushing. So Christian hip hop wasn't necessarily non-existent. It was just invisible to a lot of people. But even with that success, man, one of the things that people could realize is, and shout out to Stephen Wiley, he did his thing. Christian hip hop, what they were getting from Stephen Wiley, it just sounded polished. Cheesy in some ways, if you will, but it just sounded like it was more like just Bible teaching. As we discussed in defining what CHH is, Stephen Wiley definitely sided more of just on that ministry aspect, which makes sense. I mean, you're starting off trying to differentiate yourself from hip hop, but still deliver hip hop. As the late 80s started coming, that sound in the 90s was starting to approach. That sound started to shift a little bit. And you had more people, more artists in the game. And then that's when you start having groups starting to enter the scene. Man, you had groups like PID, Preachers in the Skies. Preachers in the Skies, they came from the East Coast, and man, they brought that boom bap sound to the Christian space. As the 80s was starting to close, Christian rap was slowly already shifting. And now we feel like it's been shifting recently. Now, it was, believe it or not, even back then, there was already shifts happening. Not only within hip hop itself, within Christian hip hop as well. So Christian hip hop in the late 80s and starting to approach the 90s, it became less Bible story and actually started being more authentic hip hop. Like Preachers in the Skies, they were doing their thing. They were actually executing and rapping with the sound at that time. So some of the notable tracks, like they released Here We Are in 1988, Back to Back in 1989. It's important to know these records, they didn't sound just like hip hop, they were hip hop. And as the 90s was approaching, in the early 90s at the same time, then the West Coast decided to speak up as well. You just had these different groups coming from different coasts. And on the West side, you had the Gospel Gangsters. And Gospel Gangsters, as the name implies, they kept that thing gangster. Then it was very clear that, oh, okay, you could actually come from the street life, be transformed by Jesus, and still testify to what God has done while being authentic to where you came from. You didn't have to code switch, you didn't have to sugarcoat it. You could actually talk about it. And that's what Gospel Gangsters did. So they were former gang members. They had real testimony, and they brought that G-Funk sound. So now these groups like Preachers in the Skies and Gospel Gangsters, man, they weren't trying to sound like what was being played. They were just making hip hop. Whether that was on the G-Funk side or the boom bap, you had authentic hip hop in the Christian hip hop space. Around this time, some people would call it holy hip hop. You had gospel rap. That was the name tied to it. But man, it was there. Christian hip hop was there. By this time in the early 90s, Christian hip hop was already starting to chart on the Billboard. One of the things that happened in the industry is that now we had the sound scan. We had the barcodes, right? And so now they were actually tracking what was selling. So there was no more guessing. There was no more phone calls. It was, okay, we could see it. So real sales started counting, and suddenly those who were invisible, or suddenly the invisible genres, like rap and metal, man, they just exploded. It was just about time where people were actually seeing, nah, hey, hip hop, we been out here moving. Like hip hop this is what's hot right now, and this is what people want. And that translated also to Christian rap. That's why immediately artists like PID and Gospel Gangsters, man, they just start hitting up the charts. You had PIDs, or Preachers in the Skies, back to back, and The Message broke into the Billboard Top Gospel Album charts. The Gospel Gangsters reached number 19 on the Christian charts. So now these groups, they didn't just suddenly become more popular. The system just finally caught up. But now what we see is that rap wasn't just tolerated anymore. It was actually profitable. There was money to be made. Imagine how that amped up some people and the eyes that started, watching this. Hip hop started splitting, if you will. You had the pop rap lane, I guess, the gentrified rap. Now the rest of America, especially within the church circles, it felt like they were able to tolerate rap now. DC Talk made it more tolerated, if you will. And man, they spent 34 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Christian album chart. But then you had the street rap lane, which was anchored by the Gospel Gangsters. And it was just being authentic to where they came from and talking about some real stuff. Man, you had PID releasing songs already talking about racism, which was unthinkable a decade earlier. So it's crazy. Some of these stuff that we deal with Christian hip hop today, it's not new. All right, this has been happening. These are pressures that some of these artists already been facing, or criticism that, you know, that was around at that time as well. Then these groups started just integrating with other artists, like Gospel Gangsters. Man, they started featuring Kurt Franklin, right? Mary Mary, and you had this integration of like, okay, Christian rap, it's actually a thing now. In the '90s, by the time Gospel Gangsters was making their breakthrough, man, hip hop was already, it was visible, like it was out there. You already had the likes of Tupac, you had the likes of Biggie, and obviously everything that happened in the '90s. You had P Diddy and all that. Hip hop, it was it was something to be reckoned with now. It wasn't just a profitable business, but it was taking over. It was a movement. A lot of today's freedom within the Christian hip hop exists because some of these originators who broke through introducing Christian in the rap scene, actually being an artist, taking it a step up as a group to actually dive in more and deliver hip hop with the skills and the storytelling. Once again, just being authentic and sharing, being raw with the message of where they came from to reach those who came from some of the same backgrounds as them so they could find out who Jesus is and follow him the same way they converted. So, man, if we think about some of the contributions from the early hip hop den, you have to imagine they basically they made a way through this forest. They were just cutting down like with a machete, just clearing the way so people could actually see, oh snap, there's like there's a way through this, right? There's actually something that we could walk into. Shout out to Stephen Wiley being a pioneer, Preachers in the Skies for executing the way they did, and the Gospel Gangsters, man, the breakthroughs that y'all had and the testimonies y'all was able to share. Man, we could see that today in today's artists as well. So shout out to some of those, and there was definitely more within those groups. You definitely had more, but just to keep it short, can't name everybody. Name some of the biggest ones there. They built permission that, hey, we could actually do this. Once permission existed, something else became possible, community. And that's why you started, even from Stephen Wiley to the groups, groups started forming. And once they started forming and started doing this, man, there was a community that started gathering around this. Which leads to the next part that we'll get into next week, like Tunnel Rats, but most notably, the cross movement.